Whether it's analysis of political campaign ads, commentary on the latest HBO series, or the way people get their news now on smartphones and tablets, Tom Proietti is the go-to guy for Rochester area media commentary. Tom is widely seen in print and on TV whenever a media-related story breaks, and his monthly appearances on Bob Smith's 1370 Connection always light up the phone banks. But for thousands of students at St. John Fisher College and MCC, Tom is a communications professor who has brought his energy and excitement around media issues to the classroom for 42 years. Tom Proietti is retiring after ending his college teaching career as the resident scholar in media here at St. John Fisher College. Coming up next, a conversation about teaching media with Tom Proietti. Stay with us. Welcome to our community forum. I'm Dr. Lauren Vicker of the Communication Journalism Department here at St. John Fisher College. And I'm a little sad to be interviewing media guru Tom Proietti about his teaching career because it's coming to an end. But thank you for coming anyway.
A pleasure, Lauren. Yeah, thank you. I'm not sad because I'm alive. I could have ended it by dying in a classroom.
Oh, please don't do that.
Well, I always thought the two places I wouldn't mind dying would be either on a golf course or in a classroom.
Golf course.
Those are two of my favorite places.
Okay,
to be,
in that particular order. So.
Yeah, well, I think dying on a golf course, like at about the 12th hole in the middle of a great round, I probably could exit thinking I was going to shoot 72 or something like that.
That'd be great.
And then people could go home and say, Donna, he died on the golf course.
He died doing something he loved.
And she'd be very pleased with that. So.
And speaking of something that you love and teaching, when you were a student here at St. John Fisher College, did you think college teaching was going to be your career?
Never once. It never once entered my mind. I mean, it just, in fact, I was a chemistry major. I started as a chem major, and I thought I'd be going to med school, and I never followed through on that because, well, I got involved in the Democrat and Chronicle, and then I also got involved in the newspaper here, then called the Pioneer, now the Cardinal Courier. And I really realized that, I was shocked to find out people could make a living doing the media. And at 14 years old, I'd had an epiphany watching a documentary with Edward R. Murrow and produced by Fred Friendly called Harvest of Shame. Oh, yeah. And I remember looking at that documentary, and my dad, who was quite a liberal social activist, I looked at him and I said, I want to do that kind of thing someday. And my father said, I don't think there's any higher calling. But my mother was convinced that medicine was a much higher calling, and she always said I had beautiful hands. I would have made a good surgeon, but I'm not sure about that. So, but college teaching just kind of, it stumbled into my lap at Syracuse University, and then I met this guy Charlie Lavery, who I really didn't know when I was here as a student, but when I came back to Rochester, I was working at Channel 10, and I interviewed him on a Saturday morning, and the rest is history. He asked me if I liked my job. And I was like, I never even thought about it. When you're 23, you don't think about things like that. And I just thought I would be doing it for the rest of my life. And he said, whatever they pay you over there, I'll give you $500 a year more, and you can have June, July, and August off. It sounded like a no-brainer. And I thought I would do it for a year. And actually, my first 3 weeks in a classroom were really torture. I was just awful. But Donna, my wife, came to observe me in a classroom, and so did Father Dorsey, Joe Dorsey, the late Joe Dorsey. He came to observe me, and they both told me pretty much the same thing: is try not to be somebody else, try to be yourself. And I remember telling Joe Dorsey, I said, he was my boss, and he was the academic dean. I said, if it's really me, I'm going to be wearing a T-shirt and jeans. And he goes, that's exactly what the college needs. I was like, okay. Next day I came in with a Superman T-shirt and a pair of jeans and some sneakers, and it's been that way ever since.
Well, that was
at least
pretty
in the classroom.
Radical in those days.
Yeah, so, really, and it really was, and I think it was good for the institution. I think it was good for me because St. John Fisher was going, as the whole nation was. It was 1969. We were going through a radical transformation of all kinds of sorts, and I remember sitting on a committee here where we talked about the possibility of going co-ed and how highly charged that was, and we were concerned that our neighbors up the road at Nazareth would be angry, and many people were concerned that the bishop would be angry, and the diocese could not imagine students being females and males being in the same classroom. And then I remember the bishop saying to us, "What's next? are they going to be in the same residence halls? And and now here we are 40 years later, and it's nothing. So.
Absolutely.
But again, back to the question of teaching. Once I got the feel for it, I couldn't imagine myself really doing much else. It was, it's the most rewarding time of my life. You know, I have a class in an hour, and I'm so excited about it. And I'm nervous. I'm not nervous about this, but still going into a classroom makes me nervous.
So what led you to Syracuse after you graduated from Fisher? Was that part of the media career?
That was the
plan?
media thing. Yeah,
okay.
right. I thought if I really wanted to progress, because my undergraduate education hadn't done enough for me, you know, there was nothing at St. John Fisher.
There was no communication program
at all.
At that time, right?
All there was a public speaking class taught by Mildred Boylan. It was one of the best classes I ever took in my life, and we love Mildred, yes. And she's a fabulous person and a great teacher, even better teacher than she is a person, if that's possible. And so I really needed to find out more about this business. And I was good friends with Jack Palvino even before then. I knew Jack when I was probably 10 years old. He happened to live next door to my uncle.
Oh, boy.
So Jack and Joyce, and you know, I watched the kids, you know, his children come into the world, and then his children, except for Jill, were my students here. And he was tremendously supportive. Jack was one of those who immediately saw, you know, when I mentioned to him one day, I said, you know, we're thinking about a communication major. And he beamed. He was like, really? He goes, kind of like St. Bonaventure? And I said, well, if I'm thinking more like Syracuse instead of just journalism, I said maybe the general field of communication. And then Marshall McLuhan got thrown into the mix as well from the University of Toronto. It turned out Charlie Lavery had hired Marshall McLuhan in his first job in 1939. And everybody at St. Mike's hated Marshall McLuhan and hated Father Lavery for it. And Charlie used to say that was the best measure of a good teacher.
Everybody was against
if they dislike you, you're probably doing the right thing.
So when you were in graduate school, did you have a chance to do any teaching? Because I know a lot of us were trained as teaching assistants.
Right. I was thrown into the mix. I was really I was a graduate assistant to a guy named Bill Bloom, but out of nowhere I was thrown into the mix to teach a class. And I found out the night before the class, one of our instructors left. He was a full professor, actually, John Ryder. He left and went to Southern Illinois overnight. I mean, he left on a Friday, and the class was supposed to start on a Monday morning, and I got a call from the department chair on a Sunday night, and I was 21 years old. And he said, well, we've been kind of sorting through the teaching assistants, and we think you'd be the best bet. And I said, but I'm supposed to be in that class. And he said, well, we have John's notes and the textbook, and I took it over, and I was terrified. I had 141 students in it, and I had a graduate teaching assistant who was 40 years old. It was an awkward experience, and I've always said in fact, a couple of years ago, I did a speech, a presentation at SU, and some of the students who were there and who were in my first class ever, I offered my apology because I always said I wanted to go back and apologize for them to them for this awful semester that they had with me, and they assured me that I wasn't that bad.
But I think in the early days, they weren't so much focused on training graduate students to teach, whereas now most of the colleges have a plan in place. So other than changing your attire, what did you do to fix your teaching style?
Well, I really made it interactive, and that's something I think Father Dorsey and Father Lavery and Father Joe Travato really helped me understand the Basilian tradition. It was something I took very seriously too, because you know, they said a lot of the Basilian tradition was built on, and not necessarily, you know, they said the Jesuit tradition was much more of lecturing and without students interacting with them. And the Basilian tradition was much more of questioning, you know, using the Platonic approach to teaching. And that just made an awful lot of sense to me, because I kept thinking about all the classes I had taken, and my favorite classes always were the ones where teachers asked us questions and got us involved in the fray, rather than lecturing to us, have us write the notes down and then take a quiz on it, and then you forget everything that's on the quiz 2 days later. But the lectures always, you know, the discussions always stuck in my brain, and I just kind of made it more and more personal every time. I realized later on in life, when I got into marketing, that the approach that I was using is something that actually had a label called customer intimacy approach. And I wanted students to call me by my first name, because at that time I was 23 years old. I was almost their age. I looked like them, and I felt like them. And that's something I've kept all the way through. And you know, I've noticed the older I've gotten, the much more difficult it is for students to call me by my first name. But every once in a while, they still do.
They're pretty respectful, I think.
Yeah, and at Fisher, they're super respectful.
Right.
I found it much easier at MCC, much more. And a lot of my students at MCC were older students too, especially in the last few years with the layoffs at Kodak and Xerox. And you know, I had a lot of students who were even 50 years old. You know, so for them to call me Tom was no big deal.
Right.
But for some of the 18 and 19-year-olds, a little bit tricky.
Yeah, exactly. So how would you say that your teachings evolved from those early days to
what a
where
great
you
question.
are now? I mean, you've been through so much because you've spent so much time at community college, which is such a different environment.
Right.
Coming back to Fisher, but you also took a few years off and worked in the
worked
media.
in the real world,
so
I think the real trick, one of the things that MCC taught me was that students can learn an awful lot by redoing things. You know, and sometimes that can be perceived, I think, by some of my colleagues the wrong way, as giving them a second chance, you know, when they shouldn't be given a second chance, because in the real world you don't get a second chance. But one of the things I found is, and I continue to do it here, in fact I'm handing back some papers today, is if you do give them a second chance, they will learn something from it. So it's not just a project that they've done and a grade that they receive, but it's an interactive kind of thing. Creates a lot more work for me, but I think, you know, I think it's worth it in the long run, because I want them to leave with a portfolio of work that they can be proud of, that they could present to an employer. So the students I have today are almost all freshmen in this class that I'm handing back today, but I know they're leaving, most of them are leaving with a portfolio of 4 pieces of work that are probably fairly good. You know, I'm quite pleased.
Excellent.
Students are very bright. The Fisher students are incredibly bright. They're hardworking. It's a much different environment than a community college environment. You know, community college environment, it's not unusual in an intro class, especially, to lose 30–40% of your students over the course of a semester.
Really?
And it's very high. And the attrition rates at almost all community colleges around the country are 50%. Students that started this September, only 50% will be back the following year. That's not necessarily bad news either. Some of them transfer to places like Fisher even after one semester. So, but the commitment levels at a place like Fisher are incredibly high, and I find that intensely rewarding, and that's why I think I've stayed as long as I have. You know, I didn't think I'd teach till 67. I know everybody in the world thought I was going to die in a classroom, and I still have a couple days for that to happen. But
no.
I hope it doesn't. Yeah. But if it does, as I said, it would be what a way to go out. Because I really do. I cherish every moment. I think I said this the other night in the so-called last lecture. Is every time I walk to a classroom, when I put my hand on the door, I just stop for a second. I look up and I think I'm looking at Charlie Lavery when I do. I say, thank you for letting me do this, because it's the best career I could ever have. But also, why would you trust me with a group of college students? You know, I'm concerned about that. And so it might be time to end that ruse and let's get on to something else.
I don't know. I think Father Lavery's looking over your shoulder.
Oh, I
so
think
maybe
he is
that's
too.
what he's making sure he keeps you honest.
Uncle Charlie had such a, I mean, my kids, Amy and Aaron, both called him Uncle Charlie, because they were never quite sure who, you know. In fact, I even told him once, I said, I found it very difficult to call someone who wasn't my dad Father. And I think my father was the one who inculcated in me that I shouldn't call a priest father. He was a non-religious person. Yeah. And he said, remember, you only have one dad. Okay. So Charlie told me right from day one, he said, call me Charlie. He said, I'm very comfortable with people calling me Charlie. And you know what he was like. He was Charlie to everyone, and to my kids, he was Uncle Charlie.
He was. He actually lived in the residence halls, and
yes,
the students told stories about him walking around in his bathrobe, visiting with them.
It never bothered him at all. Yeah. He was as much a citizen of this community as I've ever seen, and I think he made it possible for St. John Fisher College to make the great leap from being an all-male Catholic college that was kind of an extension of Aquinas and McQuaid to becoming, I mean, really, this is a highly worldly institution today. Every time I drive on campus, I'm just flabbergasted at what I see. Yeah. It's just a gorgeous, beautiful place with so much vibrance going on, and there's so much academic energy, and you know, it's just it's an electric atmosphere with brilliant students, and just a great place.
Yeah, it is. So I have to ask about, you call your students pups.
My pups, yeah.
And I feel like if I did that, people would say, she's calling us dogs. And so how is it, where did that come from, and how do you get away with that?
Well, it was, yeah, that's a great question. First off, I think male teachers can get away with a lot more than female teachers.
I definitely agree with you.
I always felt bad for my female colleagues, including you, because I think walking into a classroom for a woman is a much different experience than it is for a male. And I think we can get away with a lot more when it comes to the whole area of customer intimacy, calling by the first name and whatever, and even classroom management issues, which are not much of an issue at St. John Fisher. But probably around, I would guess about 20 years ago, I was being interviewed by Don Alhart, of all people, and he said, well, how do you refer to your students? And I didn't, mentally I thought of them as pups, because I always picture students, I always picture pups with a mother.
Like a litter of puppies.
Yeah, like a litter of pups.
Okay,
and I said, well, I'm a male, but I wish I could be a female to my students and at least be like their mother, and they're like my pups. And I thought that was an endearing term, but I didn't really want my students ever to hear that. Well, but tell Don Alhart and the whole world hears about it, and then Doug Emledge heard about it, and everybody started saying, well, they're your pups, aren't they? And a lot of students who went over to Channel 13 to intern and end up working, and I think that it was Don who kind of let it loose to the public, and I think at this point it's become an endearing term rather than one of it's not a put down at all.
Right,
In fact, I absolutely love college students. And I still can't believe I get paid for this, until I have to read the papers. And this is the first year in college, all my college teaching, where it's become a little bit of a chore. And I know that's probably when you know it's time. And I really want to leave at the top of my game. I think I'm still fairly close to the top of my game. I don't ever want students to walk out and say, the old guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He's not giving his best effort, and he's just mailing it in. I don't want to ever do that.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to media, I don't think they're going to say he doesn't know what he's talking about.
If I feel that, then I think it's time. Plus, I'm married to this incredible woman. We've been married almost 46 years, and there's a whole slew of things that we want to do. And one of the things I had to do is Donna won't go to Europe again in the summertime because it's just too hot and it's too crowded. And we had a chance to go on a trip to Italy for pretty much the month of September, and we're going to go. And she didn't think I would ever commit to that, and I don't think she wasn't offering it that way either. But I said, you know what, this is the right time to do it, because I'm 67. My dad died at 68, and his father died at 69, and you just never know. Life when we get to this age, the point that I'm at, it's best to plan out and live it as much as you can. And I'm not shortchanged on life, as you well know. I mean, this past weekend we saw 3 movies. We went out to dinner 4 times, and we had a couple of former students over for dinner last night. And I don't think that'll ever end. I think that's just part of who I am. That's part of my DNA.
Absolutely.
Poor Donna has had to pick up on it.
I did ask her one time if you ever slept, and she said he's really good at multitasking.
Yeah, it's probably a really advanced form of ADD.
Yeah.
At least I'm not ADHD. I'm definitely ADD.
So my dear friend Jim Seward, who you of course know well, retired, and he was retired for about a year, and then he started looking into some adjunct teaching opportunities, which he thinks is just enough when you're retired to teach a class, and I think it's a service to the students to have talented people in the classroom.
I was just going to say, to have somebody like Jim is like having, if he's teaching 1 class, is the equivalent of most of us teaching 3 classes, so he has that much impact.
Do you see that?
And by the way, Jim and I, we had lots of conversations about this, even before he took on the teaching thing. He said, do you think I'm doing the right thing? And I'm like, Jim, only you can decide that for you. I said, but one of the things he liked at the beginning was not having any bells to answer, and now all of a sudden you have bells to answer, and you can't take that little trip to South Carolina that he likes to do, and go visit family in Mississippi like he likes to do. And so I think he's actually figured out a way to make it work, and I'm hoping to be able to do the same thing here. I'm hoping to be available to people. We've talked about the possibility of me remaining the resident scholar in media and still doing some seminars and evening activities and whatnot. And I think that's going to be enough for me. I think I'm fine that way, and I'm still going to be teaching a class online. And I'll even be able to do that from Italy if I want to. And that's not going to be through Empire. It's through Cayuga Community College rather than MCC.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I've 25 years I taught in London. you know, every
Right,
January. And Steve Keeler at Cayuga is a dean now, and he said, you know that intro to PR class you're teaching with MCC? He said, do you want to teach it here? He said, I'll even pay you more.
Ah,
so,
okay.
Okay, so we worked out a deal, and he said he would cover for me whenever I take a trip too.
Okay, so when your friends are touring around, your wife are touring around Italy, you're not going to have to go online.
I won't have to run
deal
to
with
my
your
laptop.
students?
No,
Okay.
I know
Okay.
Steve will be taking good care of them. And in fact, he and I are going to open the class together online and kind of do it that way. And I think that's a great way to go.
So do you think that's kind of the future of where a lot of college education is going?
I
know
I
a
don't-
lot of places are doing it.
I think some
but
will, but
Fisher's done it less just because we're all about that personal.
right. And I would think
connection,
you know, I think for St. John Fisher it's off brand. You know, and it's not, and I think for MCC it's on brand, and I think for community colleges it's definitely a thing that they should offer. And we now know, I've been teaching since the first online classes were offered through SUNY since 1996, and we now know exactly who the profile is of the successful online learner. We could almost predict at the beginning of the semester just by looking age, gender, and past performance, who's going to make it and who's not. Again, attrition rates in online classes are 40%.
Yeah.
So when you start the semester with 30 students, you end the semester with maybe 18, 17 or 18. That's exactly what I had happen this semester with an intro to PR class that I'm teaching at MCC. I started with 33, and I actually have 14 who are have a chance of passing the class. The other ones have just kind of disappeared, and it takes an awful lot of personal discipline to do that. And for me, I think that's the kind of teaching I still want to do, because I can do it in my shorts. I can do it before 8 o'clock, and then 8 o'clock I can be at Shadow Lake teeing off to play around a golf
course.
So
Yep, that sounds
I have
good.
other bells to answer now, and I think I know that.
So when you look back over these 42 years, what do you think you're going to most remember? And I have to say, it's incredible. You remember so many things. You remember so many of your students and very specific details about them.
Yeah, I do.
But what's going to stand out for you when you look back?
It's always been student success. The ones that I see, see somebody like, I'll use some of the ones from here, not just from MCC, but somebody like John Zinni out with the Tennis Channel, and Jim Ziegler, who works, as a line producer out in Hollywood. I mean, it's just amazing successes. Don and I just spent a week out in Los Angeles and got to see a whole slew of former students. And sometimes people think that that's a cop-out answer on my part, but it really is student success. So one of the things I may miss is not having a group of fresh new students leaving who are going off to successful careers, but I have enough of a kind of a corral of pups.
You sure do.
So that they're going to carry me into my 90s for sure. So, and it really is. It's student success. I love seeing them succeed. I used to love them telling me that I was the reason they were successful, and my quickest answer to that is, I'm not the reason you're successful. You're the reason you're successful. And, but if they want to attribute it to me, I'll accept it for a while.
That's okay. And I love the way they help other students coming along.
That's the Fisher
alumni
brand.
network is just incredible.
The power of the Fisher brand and the Fisher alumni network is just spectacular.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Yeah.
So if you were going to give advice to a new professor starting out, or maybe a seasoned professor who's looking to refresh things, what kind of advice would you give? How would you mentor a new faculty
that's a great
member?
question. And I still mentor people, especially at MCC. One of the things I try to do is try to tell them, have as much fun as you can. I think, the notion of the serious, this is something Marshall McLuhan taught me. Marshall McLuhan said, we used to value the serious student. He said, but now that we've dug so deeply into the population pool, it's time for us to, he used to say, behave more like Johnny Carson. He said, we really have to be entertainers. And, he was very good at being an entertainer.
Exactly.
And he was funny, but he didn't accept the other side of it. He did not allow students to participate in that. If students said something funny, he nipped at them.
Oh, really?
Kind of like I own the
Sure.
stage. And I think it's really, I think we learn a lot from comedy. I think, people like George Carlin, Paula Poundstone, Richard Pryor, Chris Rock, I think comedians have great insights. Louis Black, I think, is one of the funniest, smartest people on Louis C.K., one of the funniest, smartest people I know. And I think if the classroom lightened up a little bit and got a little bit more interaction and a lot more personal touch. One of the things I love about St. John Fisher is, especially now that I've spent some time here in the last 2 years, quasi full time, is watching the students. You know, you sit with students all the time. Jack sits with students all the time. There's that, and that's something you don't see at a lot of colleges. There's a lot of that personal connection, and I think if you take that personal connection, bring it to a classroom, and I think the CJ people do it here beautifully. I just think it's very well done. So that's, you know, that would be my bit of advice is, don't be afraid and don't be mean and don't be nasty, and you know, you don't really have to be, and let them do their projects over again too, because they won't shortchange you, you know, and the ones who do, they, you know, all you have to do is say you're shortchanging yourself,
right?
And yeah, and it's especially true with Fisher students. You know, I think I find when they do it the second time, they really upgrade their work, and you know, that's I think that's a spectacular learning method, and I wish I had had more chances to do that. Wish I had more chances to take tests over again. But now I realize, for me at least, testing is just not a way I want to do much with my students. If I do, it's usually online. I have them do the testing online. I don't care whether they do it with an open book. I really want applied knowledge more than anything else, because that's the thing they need coming out of a place like this.
Yeah. So do you think for a new faculty member, community college or a place like Fisher's a better training ground for teaching?
Community college. Yeah, I
Really?
learned much more about teaching at MCC. And my first 2 years at MCC, I really learned how to teach.
Really?
Because you're thrown into, you know, with the median age of a student at MCC is 28. So you're and the students are all over the place. You know, many of them had never expected to go to college, and you have to kind of bring out any potential possibility that they might have, and do it as gently as possible, and at the same time be incredibly firm. So I have this terrible reputation at MCC about being totally unaccepting of people coming into a classroom late. And one of the things I used to say is, and I don't have that problem here at Fisher, but I could say at MCC was, as a community college teacher, if there's nothing else I can teach you, is you have to show up, and you have to show up on time. In fact, you better be a little bit early, because that's what it's like in the real world.
Wow.
It's a great training ground for teaching, absolutely. And probably Donna would probably say kindergarten, where she taught, would be the best training ground. I could never survive a kindergarten class. There's no way. I used to go read to her students, and there's no way. They should be paid combat pay. And they're the cutest creatures in the world, but I don't know how you manage them.
But you're on all the time, whereas with a college class, the longest it might be would be 3 hours.
Kindergarten students don't even know how to get in line. Yeah. You know, they don't even know what that. They're not quite sure what that means. You know, it takes the full year of kindergarten to convince them, you know, or to teach them what standing in line is. You know, at least my students know how to stand in line.
They know how to do that.
The college students are pretty good at standing in line, if we ever have to do that.
Yeah. So. Well, Tom Proietti, on behalf of all of your students from MCC and St. John Fisher and the faculty, I want to thank you for all your years of service. Thank you for joining us today, and wish you the best in retirement. And if you do want to come back at any point, just let us know.
I'll be back to make trouble.
Okay.
I love you guys.
Thanks.
Take care.
Tom.
Bye-bye.